Imagine a grandiose, terrifying experiment. In 324 BC, Alexander the Great decided to forge a new race of rulers by erasing the borders between the Greek world and the Asian satrapies. On a single spring day, dozens of noble female captives from Persia and Bactria became the wives of the highest-ranking officers in his army. A mere year later, the 32-year-old conqueror breathed his last in the stifling heat of Babylon. As his empire plunged into absolute chaos, almost all of his celebrated generals disgustedly dissolved these forced unions. They cold-bloodedly cast their barbarian wives out to fend for themselves in favor of far more lucrative marriages with Macedonian princesses. Out of all those arranged unions, only one survived. Herein lies the greatest enigma of the Hellenistic era. The only woman to retain her status was not some submissive slave, but the daughter of Alexander's most ferocious enemy, a young woman from the harsh lands of Sogdiana, whose tribe had spent years slaughtering Macedonian detachments in the sands of Central Asia. Her name was Apama. In the new world forged by the invaders, she was considered nothing more than an elegant trophy handed over to a commander of the elite infantry named Seleucus. Yet, this disenfranchised prize of war transformed into the most lethal diplomatic weapon of the century. The phalanx was exceptional at shattering fortress walls, but great powers do not stand on sarissas alone. They are stitched together by women. Without Apama's invisible influence, it is highly unlikely that Seleucus could have ever held on to the colossal territories stretching from Syria to the Indian Ocean. The era of the bloody wars of the Diadochi is about to unfold before you in a completely different light, through the eyes of a foreigner caught in the very center of a political viper's nest. We are going to understand how did her father's severed head teach a young princess the ultimate lesson in survival? How did a refugee hiding in the sands of Egypt learn to finance massive expeditions and literally buy the loyalty of entire cities? Finally, history will lead us to a stunning climax, the exact moment when the Eastern sovereign comes face to face with a young, pure-blooded rival. Apama will completely outplay her husband's new favorite without resorting to daggers or poison. She will use a scandalous, mind-bending romance to permanently weave her Sogdian blood into the genetic code of the greatest throne in Asia. This is not just a chronicle of ancient battles. This is an absolute masterclass in political adaptation, cold-blooded calculation, and seizing the future. To unravel the true character of the woman who conquered the East, we need to travel to the very heart of scorching Asia. It is the late 320s BC. Bactria and Sogdiana, harsh, unforgiving lands located in the territory of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Alexander the Great had crushed the colossal Persian Empire in just 4 short years. However, here, in these boundless steppes, the invincible Macedonian war machine suddenly stalled out. For 3 long, grueling years, the conqueror king hunted down a single solitary commander who had incited an audacious guerrilla rebellion. This elusive leader was named Spitamenes. Amidst this endless hunt, in damp mountain caves and the choking dust of exhausting marches, his daughter Apama was growing up. Her childhood bore little resemblance to the life of typical princesses. The girl knew nothing of marble halls or silk cushions. Raised by hardened nomads, accustomed to falling asleep to the shouts of armed sentries, she absorbed the brutal laws of survival in a world where the slightest weakness inevitably led to death. By 328 BC, the net of the Macedonian manhunt had finally closed. Alexander's generals drove Spitamenes into a deadly trap, cutting his army off from all supplies and avenues of retreat. The Sogdian chieftain planned to fight to his absolute last breath. In a cruel twist of irony, the rebel leader was expecting the fatal blow to come from the long pikes of the enemy phalanx, placing his complete trust in the canvas walls of his own tent. He saw his family as his one and only reliable sanctuary, but the fatal blade touched his neck not on the battlefield at all. In the dead of night, as the exhausted Spitamenes fell asleep, his own wife crept up to his bed. Realizing that the war was entirely lost, Apama's mother decided to buy her own pardon at a horrifying price. With a swift swing of a short sword, she cold-bloodedly decapitated her sleeping husband. The Roman historian Curtius Rufus preserved this chilling scene in vivid detail. The woman hid the severed head in the folds of her garments, secretly slipped out of the camp, and personally carried this blood-soaked trophy straight into the tent of Alexander the Great, casually tossing it right at the king's feet. Look at this waking nightmare through the eyes of the young Apama. In a single instant, she lost her father, her homeland, and her entire future. The young girl received the most brutal lesson in political psychology that the ancient world could possibly teach. She learned once and for all, loyalty is a complete illusion. Blind love only makes a person vulnerable, and the only one who survives is the one who strikes first. Left as a complete orphan in iron chains, the Sogdian princess was transformed into silent spoils of war. The occupiers stripped her of everything she had, turning her into a living, breathing symbol of her people's devastating defeat. The captive daughter of the vanquished enemy is shipped off to Susa, where Alexander is preparing an absolutely grandiose celebration. Stripped of any voice or agency, she arrives in the capital strictly as a symbol of the East's total submission. The conqueror fully intends to dictate her destiny with a single stroke of his pen. Carrying such heavy, traumatic baggage, the young woman is thrust straight into the epicenter of Macedonian intrigues. Here, beneath the canopy of an opulent pavilion, she is destined to become the mere shadow of one of the very generals whose soldiers had only recently ravaged her cities. It is the spring of 324 BC. Susa, the ancient capital of the Persians, is drowning in unimaginable luxury. Alexander the Great decides to fundamentally rewrite human nature itself. He erects a majestic pavilion supported by pillars of solid gold, a theatrical stage for his grand experiment. The conqueror truly believes he is forging the elites of the West and the East together into a single, unified race of rulers. But his hardened veterans see this as nothing more than the ridiculous whim of a dictator who has betrayed their sacred traditions. For them, these marriages are purely a political stunt, and the brides are merely temporary hostages. Stepping into the very center of this grand spectacle is Apama. The young Sogdian princess, having lost her homeland, is handed over to a man whose troops had literally stormed her fortresses. Her new husband is the 34-year-old Seleucus, commander of the elite Hypaspists. This seasoned warrior is accustomed to solving problems with the swift swing of a sword, and to him, this foreign woman is nothing but a living trophy received strictly by royal decree. Neither of them even suspects it yet. This very wedding night is laying the bedrock foundation of a dynasty that will outlast Alexander's empire by centuries. A year passes. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander dies in Babylon. His colossal realm, entirely devoid of a clear heir, instantly begins tearing apart at the seams. We remember from our previous episodes how Perdiccas vainly attempted to cling to power and how Ptolemy brazenly hijacked the king's sarcophagus. In an atmosphere of absolute total paranoia, the generals hastily begin shedding any excess dead weight. They desperately need alliances back in Europe and pure Macedonian bloodlines. 79 top commanders boot their eastern wives out into the streets without a single moment of hesitation. Princesses who just yesterday shared a bed with the new masters of the world are abruptly transformed into disenfranchised exiles wandering the dusty streets of Babylon. But Seleucus does the unthinkable. He actually stays with Apama. Behind this shocking decision lies no romantic passion, but purely cold, hard calculation. Seleucus watches the bloody slaughter unfolding around the throne and thinks strictly in terms of geopolitics. Unlike his fierce competitors, he doesn't actually possess any land of his own yet. During the partition of the empire, he was unceremoniously shoved into a secondary role, appointed merely as the commander of the cavalry. Lacking any royal blood, he remains highly vulnerable in the eyes of the elite aristocracy. Apama radically changes this entire equation. Across the vast expanses of the Iranian plateau and out in the steppes of Sogdiana, she is the daughter of the legendary Spitamenes, an undeniable figure of absolute authority. Had he remained alone, Seleucus would have been perceived by the locals as just another foreign occupier. By maintaining the marriage, he instantly transforms into the legitimate son-in-law of the East. Apama becomes his ultimate political shield and the one and only key to securing the loyalty of the local nobility, without which holding on to Asia is physically impossible. Soon, their union acquires an almost mystical power. The court begins to actively cultivate an ancient prophecy. The god Apollo had supposedly once appeared to Seleucus's mother, promising incredible greatness to his descendants. And when Apama gives birth to their firstborn son, Antiochus, the priests loudly proclaim a divine miracle. They discovered a birthmark in the distinct shape of an inverted anchor on his infant's thigh. This specific mark will become the sacred brand of the Seleucid dynasty, the ultimate symbol of their divine right to rule. Apama proved her immense value. She gifted her husband a male heir, flawlessly binding a Macedonian myth directly to Eastern blood. It seemed Apama's position was utterly unshakable. She was the sole survivor of the catastrophic political storm that had swallowed up all the other brides. But this glittering triumph would prove to be merely the calm before a devastating fall. 7 years later, not a single trace of her safety or luxury would remain. The most influential woman in all of Asia would lose absolutely everything, keeping nothing but a travel cloth and 50 horsemen as she fled for her life from the terrifying wrath of Antigonus the One-Eyed through the scorching sands of the desert. In 316 BC, the illusion of safety came crashing down. The indestructible Antigonus the One-Eyed, having subjugated nearly all of Asia, made a triumphant entry into Babylon. The newly minted Lord of the East brazenly demanded a full financial audit from Seleucus, which, in the brutal language of the Diadochi, translated directly to a thinly veiled death sentence. The couple had absolutely no choice left. Under the dark cover of night, abandoning their lavish palaces and a freshly amassed treasury, they fled headlong into the scorching desert. Only 50 fiercely loyal horsemen rode out with them. Antigonus scoffed with utter contempt as he watched the pathetic handful of fugitives disappear into the distance. The aging Titan genuinely believed he had permanently wiped this petty satrap and his foreign wife off the geopolitical chessboard. In reality, he had just made a catastrophically fatal error. The great commander had single-handedly sent Apama straight to the finest political university in the ancient world, the royal court of the Egyptian king Ptolemy. Alexandria greeted the ragged exiles with the blinding brilliance of its newly constructed marble colonnades.
For Seleucus, these 4 long years morphed into an agonizing, teeth-grinding wait for revenge. But for his wife, they became a masterclass in the absolute highest level of political intrigue. She watched Ptolemy's wife, the great Berenice, with a ravenous, analytical hunger. Berenice had arrived in Egypt as a penniless, widowed lady-in-waiting, yet she somehow managed to orchestrate the exile of the legitimate queen, strip the firstborn heir of his inheritance, and completely subjugate the mighty pharaoh to her will. Apama studied this woman and absorbed an entirely different set of survival laws. If, out in the unforgiving steppes of Sogdiana, absolute power was measured by the sharpness of a blade, then here, in Alexandria, it was forged through calculated whispers in royal bedchambers, strategic bribery, and flawlessly intercepted intelligence. The Sogdian princess was actively learning how to weaponize gold and deploy networks of spies, quickly realizing a profound truth. Invisible influence strikes with far greater precision than the heaviest cavalry charge. From a silent prize of war, she was aggressively forging herself into an absolutely unparalleled master strategist. Her golden opportunity to apply this newly acquired knowledge finally arrived in 312 BC. Ptolemy decisively crushed the Antigonid army at the Battle of Gaza, and his ally Seleucus desperately begged him for troops to go take back Babylon. The king of Egypt, almost as if he were actively mocking him, allocated exactly 1,000 men, 800 infantrymen, and 200 cavalry. With this pathetic handful of desperate daredevils, Seleucus stepped back into the boundless expanse of Asia, a territory completely locked down by Antigonus's gigantic military garrisons. It was a blatantly suicidal mission, virtually guaranteed to end in a bloody, catastrophic failure. Let's break down the actual anatomy of this so-called miracle. Why exactly did the most heavily fortified citadels in Mesopotamia surrender one after another to 1,000 ragged, unwashed soldiers? Macedonian chroniclers enthusiastically attribute this incredible triumph exclusively to the unparalleled military genius of their leader. But look at the situation strictly through the eyes of the local population. The inhabitants of the Iranian plateau and Babylon weren't throwing their massive gates wide open because they were terrified of 200 Greek horsemen. They were actively opening them because Apama was riding right alongside Seleucus. The daughter of the legendary Spitamenes served as the ultimate symbol of legitimate, native, homegrown authority to the Asian elites. It wasn't just another faceless Macedonian occupier coming back to them. It was their very own queen returning, bringing ironclad guarantees of protection for their ancient temples and the local aristocracy. The cultural code embedded in the Sogdian princess operated with vastly more devastating efficiency than the heaviest siege engines ever could, effortlessly handing the capital back to the exiles and officially launching the countdown of the Seleucid era. They clawed back their power and deeply entrenched themselves in the very heart of the scorching East. But this stunning triumph was immediately accompanied by a chilling, bone-deep sense of vulnerability. The ancient megalopolis was ultimately nothing more than a tiny, fragile island floating in a massive ocean of enemies. And the king was about to depart on multi-year military campaigns to reconquer India. Left entirely alone at the helm of a vast, volatile, and seething territory, Apama realized a harsh truth. Her eastern blood was more than enough to swing open heavy city gates, but it was far too little to guarantee the ongoing loyalty of heavily armed Greek mercenaries. She urgently needed to aggressively buy up the loyalty of the West. The great city was taken, but to actually build a durable, lasting empire, this supposed barbarian would have to become more Greek than the Greeks themselves. And she was about to initiate a high-stakes game that would fundamentally rewrite the financial laws of the known ecumeny.
Seleucus sets off on a string of seemingly endless military campaigns. First, he drives deep into India, where he strikes a truly historic deal, literally trading away his eastern frontiers in exchange for 500 massive war elephants. Next, he furiously marches his vast armies westward to absolutely crush the 80-year-old titan Antigonus the One-Eyed on the blood-soaked plains of Ipsus. For an entire decade, the king abandons Babylon, leaving behind the colossal, barely pacified territories of the Iranian plateau. According to every established canon of Macedonian military strategy, he is strictly obligated to entrust his rear to a hardened, battle-scarred regent drawn from the ranks of his senior generals. But Seleucus shatters the mold entirely. He hands the absolute keys to all of Asia directly over to Apama. The incredibly arrogant Greek military commanders genuinely believed that the entire world bowed exclusively to the tips of their long sarissas. The actual truth, however, was staggering. While the Macedonians fantasized about achieving global domination on muddy battlefields, the foundational stability of half the known world rested squarely on the shoulders of a Sogdian woman. Apama entirely outgrows the narrow role of being merely a monarch's wife, rapidly transforming herself into an independent, unshakable, and absolute institution of sovereign power. Before us lies the sprawling map of a newly born state. Seleucus aggressively constructs dozens of new settlements, desperately striving to immortalize his own name in solid stone. However, 3 highly strategic megalopolises, located in fertile Syria, right at the bustling trade crossroads of the Euphrates and deep in rugged Media, are explicitly named Apamea. Apamea in Syria alone will very soon become home to 500,000 inhabitants, evolving into the absolute primary military hub of the entire empire, serving as the massive barracks for those very same Indian war elephants. A sprawling city, directly named in honor of a woman who was a captive prisoner just yesterday, now fiercely pulses as the very heartbeat of the Macedonian military machine. Successfully governing such unimaginably vast territories demands far more than just thick stone walls. It requires truly colossal financial resources. Apama masterfully adapts an ancient Achaemenid tradition to suit her own specific needs. For generations, Persian overlords had routinely granted their royal wives control over incredibly wealthy valleys, the tax revenues from which were playfully dubbed funds for her girdle, for her sandals, or for her necklaces. But while previous queens had happily squandered these immense riches on pretty jewelry, Apama was actively commanding finances easily comparable to the entire military budgets of fully independent sovereign nations. Rather than blowing it all on importing fine silks, she systematically invests it into something infinitely more valuable, the unshakable loyalty of the West. When the seasoned commander Demodamas of Miletus plans an incredibly dangerous expedition across the Jaxartes, pushing right to the very borders of the queen's harsh homeland, it is none other than Apama who entirely bankrolls the massive campaign. Demodamas penetrates deep into the wild, untamed steppes where Cyrus the Great had once perished, and triumphantly erects grand altars to Apollo of Didyma, the divine patron god of the Seleucids. This brilliantly calculated gesture yields a truly deafening ideological success, and the deeply grateful citizens of the Greek city of Miletus, having just received incredibly lavish donations from the Eastern sovereign to completely rebuild their ruined temple, proceed to do the utterly unthinkable. Right in the very center of Hellas, they proudly erect a massive bronze statue in honor of a so-called barbarian. What actually lay behind this seemingly fantastical display of generosity? Apama possessed absolutely phenomenal political instincts.
she perfectly understood her single greatest vulnerability. To the incredibly arrogant Macedonian elite, she would always, permanently, remain a total outsider. To successfully secure the throne for her half-blood son, Antiochus, she explicitly needed to become far more Greek than the Greeks themselves. By lavishly financing massive temples in ancient polis, she was actively forging an absolutely flawless public reputation. The queen brilliantly wrapped her rugged steppe origins in a dazzling, gleaming layer of classical antiquity, decisively proving that she was more than capable of being a highly civilized, sophisticated patron of both the arts and sciences. Her vast power had reached its absolute zenith. The state was flourishing beautifully. The regent's supreme authority was universally recognized from Ionia all the way to Bactria, and young Antiochus was busy preparing to inherit the greatest legacy on the face of the earth. But in the ruthlessly unforgiving world of ancient politics, a shining triumph all too often serves merely as the prelude to total disaster. The devastating blow came from a direction no one could have possibly anticipated. Having secured a massive victory at Ipsus and carved up the known world, the 60-year-old Seleucus decided to tightly lock in his geopolitical success with a brand new dynastic alliance. He did not return to the capital alone. The king proudly paraded into the royal palace the one person who, according to every known law of courtly intrigue, was mathematically guaranteed to grind Apama into absolute dust. A young woman possessing the flawlessly pure royal blood of Macedon, a brand new wife who actually turned out to be younger than Apama's very own son.
In the immediate aftermath of his staggering triumph at Ipsus and the subsequent carving up of the world, Seleucus Nicator slammed headfirst into a brand new geopolitical reality. He commanded the absolute boundless expanses of Asia, yet he completely and totally lacked a powerful naval fleet to actively defend his vulnerable western maritime borders. Deeply fearing a sudden alliance among his former comrades in arms, the 60-year-old king executes a highly pragmatic, deeply calculated political maneuver. In 299 BC, he openly strikes an alliance with the undisputed Lord of the Seas, the very same anti-hero from our previous episodes, Demetrius Poliorcetes, a man he had only recently crushed on the battlefield. The high-stakes deal is sealed in the most traditional manner possible for the Diadochi. Seleucus takes Demetrius's daughter as his new bride. The young chosen one is named Stratonice. The 17-year-old princess carries flawlessly pure Macedonian blood in her veins. Just picture the grand arrival of this massive flotilla on the shores of Syria. The deep purple sails of Demetrius's warships, the blindingly bright armor of the elite royal guard gleaming in the hot sun, and the young princess confidently stepping onto the sands of Asia as the new absolute mistress of the empire. Seleucus greets her with utterly unimaginable pomp and circumstance. For the royal entourage, this marriage signifies one thing and one thing only: the era of Apama is officially over. According to every single unspoken rule of the ancient world, the aging Eastern wife, a former prisoner of war, is strictly supposed to fade away quietly into the shadows. Her half-blood son, Antiochus, is universally predicted to meet a very grim, unenviable fate. The absolute second this young Macedonian beauty gifts the king with pure-blooded heirs, the Sogdian line will be ruthlessly severed from power. It is highly likely that the eldest son will be outright assassinated, purely to guarantee the safety of the new heir to the throne. And soon enough, Stratonice actually does bear Seleucus a child.
the abstract threat suddenly takes on terrifying, breathing flesh. Let's see exactly how Apama herself chose to respond to this massive existential challenge. The vast majority of rejected ancient queens in a similar humiliating situation would have immediately devolved into hysterics, frantically hired assassins, or quietly slipped deadly poison into their golden goblet. Just recall Olympias, the terrifying mother of Alexander the Great, who used to cold-bloodedly eliminate all her competitors, utilizing the most unimaginably brutal methods. But Apama, who had grown up in the harsh, unforgiving steppes of Bactria and had completely mastered all the subtle, deadly nuances of Eastern court intrigue, utterly despised such crude, amateurish solutions. She clearly understood the stakes. The sudden death of young Stratonice would instantly ignite a brand new global war and provoke the totally uncontrollable, blinding wrath of Seleucus himself. So, rather than reaching for a rusty dagger, she actively deployed the immense, crushing weight of cold political gravity. By deliberately shifting the battlefield away from the royal bedchamber and directly onto the grand chessboard of the empire, Stratonice conclusively demonstrated her true, irreplaceable value to her husband. The queen heavily focused all of her vast accumulated influence directly on the Eastern elites, the powerful priests of Babylon, and the heavily armed satraps of Iran. She softly, yet with absolute ironclad firmness, made one thing perfectly clear. The pure-blooded Macedonians were more than welcome to play at ruling the palace in Antioch, but without the daughter of the legendary Spitamenes, the colossal East would instantly erupt in a massive, unstoppable rebellion. Apama absolutely refused to stoop to fighting over her husband's bed. Instead, she successfully transformed herself into the ultimate controlling stake of the entire state, effectively guaranteeing that Antiochus would securely retain the absolute backing of literally half the known ecumeny. By meticulously constructing this impenetrable, ironclad defense, the mother cold-bloodedly shielded the future of her firstborn son. This intense positional deadlock completely trapped the palace inhabitants in a suffocating, incredibly toxic atmosphere of hidden, simmering tension. The young Macedonian princess doubtless held the heart of the rapidly aging king, but the Eastern queen maintained a death grip on the absolute keys to his boundless empire. The state was terrifyingly teetering on the very brink of an inevitable catastrophic schism, merely waiting for the ticking dynastic crisis to violently tear it apart from the inside out. It would take a truly radical, utterly unthinkable event to somehow slice through this impossible knot, and it finally arrived from a direction literally no one could have ever seen coming. How on earth does an aging former captive permanently eliminate a pure-blooded royal princess without spilling a single solitary drop of blood? The shocking answer materialized in the form of a highly bizarre, mysterious illness that suddenly struck down the heir to the throne, leaving every single renowned physician in Asia completely, utterly powerless. By 294 BC, a wave of icy, paralyzing panic completely grips the royal court in Antioch. The heir to the mighty throne, 29-year-old Antiochus, is literally wasting away right before everyone's eyes. This incredibly tough warrior, heavily hardened by brutal military campaigns, outright refuses all food, completely shuts himself off from the outside world, and is very clearly preparing to die. The young man's deeply mysterious ailment directly threatens the very existence of the colossal state. The sprawling territories of the Seleucids stretch all the way from the Aegean Sea straight to India, a staggering distance roughly comparable to a road trip from modern-day Madrid all the way to Tehran. The sudden death of the one and only adult successor will inevitably hurl this cyclopean, massive mechanism straight into a terrifying abyss of bloody civil wars. The absolute best healers in all of Asia throw their hands up in total, helpless defeat, quietly suspecting some terrifying, unknown magical curse. Erasistratus, the brilliant royal court physician and a truly outstanding anatomist, steps up to desperately unravel the mystery. He refuses to leave the sickbed for days on end, meticulously studying the patient's subtle physical reactions to every single person who walks into the room. The shocking diagnosis is definitively confirmed the exact second the young stepmother, the 17-year-old Stratonice, crosses the threshold of the royal chambers. Just look closely at the fascinating details of this clinical picture. The very moment the beautiful Macedonian princess even approaches the bed, Erasistratus observes a massive violent spike in his patient's pulse. Antiochus's face is instantly flooded with a deep crimson blush. A heavy sweat breaks out across his forehead. His breathing completely hitches, and his voice breaks off into total silence. The seasoned doctor flawlessly recognizes the exact same symptoms once famously described by the poet Sappho. Completely broken by an all-consuming, terrifying passion, yet deeply chained by his intense filial duty, the prince had actively chosen to starve himself to death rather than ever betray his own father. Upon learning the shocking truth, the 60-year-old Seleucus executes a maneuver that will forever be enshrined in the grand annals of diplomacy. At a massive general assembly, standing right in front of thousands of utterly stunned military veterans, the Supreme Lord of Asia loudly announces an immediate, formal divorce. He publicly hands Stratonice over to become his own son's wife, crowns both of them with royal diadems, and officially appoints them as the absolute co-rulers of the upper satrapies, the entire eastern half of his sprawling empire. Traditionally, historians see this simply as the noble, heartbreaking sacrifice of a loving child, desperately saving his dying child. However, hidden right beneath this highly theatrical gesture was an incredibly complex, masterful geopolitical maneuver that completely redrew the entire architecture of global power. The ultimate irony here is that the true, absolute victor in this massive crisis was the one person whose name wasn't even mentioned out on the public square. While it was indeed the doctor who identified the actual medical cause, it was the sheer, suffocating strategic influence of Apama that successfully transformed a messy family drama into an unprecedented political triumph. The sheer scale of her victory is absolutely staggering. Without using a single drop of poison or hiring a single assassin, she completely neutralized her one and only rival. The pure-blooded Macedonian princess, the very woman entirely capable of bearing the king fully legitimate Western heirs, was elegantly and efficiently removed and shipped far away to the distant east. This massive existential threat was brilliantly transformed into the ultimate, most powerful asset for Apama's own son. Antiochus didn't just survive. He was handed direct control over literally half the known ecumen, the unshakable status of undisputed successor, and an absolutely flawless political ally in the form of his new wife. The former captive from Sogdina had completely and utterly outplayed the arrogant Macedonian elite across the board. She saved her bloodline, permanently and inextricably weaving her own genetics right into the very foundation of a global throne. For the entirety of the next 2.5 centuries, and time span actually exceeding the entire independent history of the United States, every single reigning monarch of the Seleucid dynasty would carry the fierce blood of the steppe rebel Spitamenes in their veins. Yesterday's helpless prize of war decisively proved one thing: true absolute power is measured strictly by the ability to force time itself to work for your own legacy.
Apama traversed an absolutely incredible path, rising from a totally disenfranchised captive to the untouchable supreme matriarch of a massive empire. Out of the 80 brides at the Susa weddings, she alone managed to completely rewrite the rules of the game. A stunning paradox emerges. The actual might of the Macedonian state in Asia rested not on the glorious legacy of Alexander, but firmly on the lineage of his most bitterly sworn enemy's daughter. This confirms a profound, undeniable truth. True power is dictated not by marching legions, but by the blood right of those who actually sit upon the throne. The ecumeny would continue to reap the rich rewards of this truly triumphant union for centuries to come. However, this was really just the beginning. The heavy crown would very soon pass to their son, Antiochus Soter. This half-blood king would be forced to fiercely defend his mother's incredible legacy against massive, terrifying hordes of wild Galatians, leading highly destructive Indian war elephants directly into the thick of battle. It is precisely his grand deeds that will go on to shape the entire future of Asia. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to see exactly what happens next. Drop a like if our heroine's brilliant strategy impressed you even more than the bloody clash of military titans. And let me know down in the comments, do you think Antiochus's burning passion for his young stepmother was just a tragic, fatal accident, or the subtly calculated masterstroke of the queen herself? I'll see you in the next episodes.